Well, it's my privilege and honor to be giving this lecture today for the Benson-Henry Institute for Mind-Body Medicine. Mind-Body medicine, a topic that's always been very important for me. And I'd like to thank Greg Fashone and Dashan Mehta for the invitation to speak today. I want to talk about three of my favorite topics and emphasize how related they all are: Alzheimer's disease, brain health, especially maintaining brain health with age, and the importance of mindfulness in terms of maintaining brain health and trying to stave off Alzheimer's disease. I've been studying Alzheimer's disease my entire career at Mass General and Harvard, and along the way, I've taken on some outside roles. So I need to show you first my disclosures of companies with whom I'm a paid consultant or have a financial interest, or both. I will also not be mentioning off-label use of any drugs in this talk, but may mention some of these companies along the way where appropriate. So Alzheimer's disease, as I'm sure you all know, it's really the most common form of dementia in the elderly. When people ask the difference between Alzheimer's and dementia, dementia is to Alzheimer's as fruit is to apple. Apple is one of the most common fruits. Alzheimer's is the most common form of dementia in the elderly. Dementia being catastrophic loss of cognition, learning, and memory ability. And although we say there's actually about 6 million patients in this country today, and it's costing probably over $350 billion per year, so this is the first important point, is that if you ask how many people in this country have Alzheimer's pathology already beginning in their brain, but don't yet have symptoms, that number can be as high as 38 million people. That's because, like heart disease and diabetes and other age-related illnesses, Alzheimer's disease actually begins decades before symptoms. And one of the biggest problems that I'll keep getting back to is that we don't diagnose this disease until the brain has degenerated to the point of dysfunction. We don't do that with heart disease. We don't wait till you have congestive heart failure before we check your cholesterol. We don't wait until you've lost half of your beta cells in your pancreas before we diagnose you with diabetes. No, we check glucose and insulin and cholesterol. But for the brain, we don't check anything. And I'm going to talk to you also about the McCance Center for Brain Health, where we're trying to come up with indicators, biomarkers for brain health, so we'll know in advance when someone's getting into trouble and practice, just like we do for other age-related diseases, early detection, early intervention. But for now, we're stuck with what we have. We diagnosed this disease when there's already been enough damage in the brain that there are already symptoms of dementia. And we know that in terms of risk for this disease, age is number one, family history number two, head injury, and also sex or gender. 2/3 of Alzheimer's patients are women. They seem to be more prone, especially to inflammation in the brain, which is one of the biggest killer of nerve cells in the brain. And if you ask about the prevalence of this disease and why is it getting so much bigger, well, the fastest growing segment of our population is 85 plus. If you look on the right side of the slide here, in 1960, we had a pyramid, right? There were many more younger people than older people, but by the time you got up to 85 plus up here, it was the peak of the pyramid. But by 2060, 100 years later, and in the future, we're going from a pyramid to a pillar. You're going to have almost equal numbers of older people, including up around 80, 85 plus, as you do younger people. So current lifespan is already 80, but at the age of 85 and over, depending on the study you look at, it's anywhere from 30 to 50% of people who have already started the early signs or have full symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. So as we get older and older this century and live longer, our brain health span is not going to keep up with our lifespan. Modern medicine has us living longer, but our brain health is not going to keep up unless we do something about preserving and promoting brain health and preventing Alzheimer's disease and other age-related brain diseases early in life. That would be the big goal of many of the things I'll talk about today, whether it's through drug discovery or through lifestyle interventions. So we have a pandemic. We have what we call the silver tsunami beginning now and continuing in this country. And how I try to link brain health and Alzheimer's is the following. If we can understand from the most common disease of the brain that threatens healthy brain function, Alzheimer's disease, what goes wrong with the brain? Can that teach us how to promote and preserve what goes right with the brain? Can we learn from Alzheimer's disease and what goes wrong, how to maximize the physical health of our brains, how to, in the process, unleash mental vitality, the true power of our minds? I always like to say, as we get older and we have all this wisdom to impart on the younger people, right? Where all of our experiences throughout life developing this internal wisdom. Imagine if our brain health, our focus, our acuity kept up at the same time. So you had the combination of great brain health and great mental vitality so that you could really even better share that wisdom with the next generations, that wisdom that comes with experience and age. Well, Alzheimer's disease takes your neural network, your 100 billion neurons, the tens of trillions of connections between them called synapses, this whole tapestry, all created by your experiences your whole life, sculpting that neural network and creating that tapestry. And Alzheimer's rips it apart thread by thread. And to some extent, this happens with aging. I like to compare it to getting arthritis in your knee. In my case, I played way too much basketball with kids younger than me, way too long. Things break down, the brain breaks down. But unlike the rest of the body, we don't monitor the breakdown in the brain, and we don't try to stop it. That's what we need to do. And that's one of the reasons why I worked with the Cure Alzheimer's Fund, who's trying to figure out how to stop, prevent, and treat Alzheimer's disease, and with the McCance Center for Brain Health, trying to find the earliest indicators of brain health going downhill, finding ways to intervene with that, and ultimately getting that integrated into normal healthcare on a regular basis. So let's begin with where Alzheimer's began. This is Dr. Alzheimer's in the corner here. This is his first patient, August Dieter. She was a 55-year-old woman, and she was admitted to this place called Ehrenschloss, stood for Castle of the Insane. So, they weren't very careful with names back then in Bavaria, in Germany. And he said this 55-year-old woman was admitted with memory loss, hallucinations, and screaming for hours in the middle of the night. She also became insanely jealous and paranoid in her normal life. And he's interviewing her and he's writing down his notes in his journal. And he asked her, "What is your name?" And she correctly replied, "August." Then he said, "What is your husband's name?" And she said, "I believe August." So she's confused. And then he said, "Where are you right now?" And she said, "Here and everywhere, here and now." Now, I wrote 3 books I'll talk about a little later with Deepak Chopra. If Deepak Chopra says that, you think, oh, he's having a great meditation. That's a great answer. But, if you have Alzheimer's disease and you really don't know where you are or when you are, you can't make that connection with your world. It's horrific. It's terrifying. It's one of the worst outcomes you can imagine as you get older. And this is what we really want to stave off and try to stop. And she frequently cried over and over, he wrote in his journal. She frequently cried over and over, "Oh God, I have lost myself." And that's what this disease does. It robs you of yourself. It robs your loved ones, friends, family of yourself. Because everybody who knows you, including yourself, knows you based on who you are, your personality, all that tapestry that's been created by experience your whole life, all slowly ripped away by this disease. So what do we know about it? What is self? Let's start with, she said, "I lost myself." What is self? I like to explain it this way. You got the brain, which is an organ in the body, and some parts of the brain allow you to breathe and keep your heart rate going automatically, your autonomic function. The oldest part of the brain controls your instincts, fight or flight, finding food, sex to propagate the species, all the things that can also get you into trouble. And you also have the rest of the brain, which is bringing you sensations, seeing, hearing me now, tasting, touching, feeling. Your brain also brings you imagination. Your brain is recapitulating thoughts and experiences in terms of imagination, including when you dream. And your brain brings you emotions. It allows you to experience feelings and thoughts, memories of the day, often reiterated in your brain as words. So I'll get back to this, but this is often referred to as SIFT, S-I-F-T, or SIFT. And Daniel Siegel came up with this term, SIFT. Now, the mind, in contrast, is, I like to say, a dynamic process by which you experience what your brain brings you. In other words, your brain is an organ it's taking in photons through your eyes and auditory waves through your ears. These are just signals, just pure signals. And then your brain converts those signals into meaningful information. And as you experience that information, as those signals have made sense, as you learn what things mean, that is how you experience your brain, through your mind, a dynamic process. Self now is the whole thing. You being experienced in your mind thanks to your brain. You being experienced in your mind thanks to your brain. So in a sense, you're the observer of this process, the observer of your brain bringing in signals, making sense of that, turning it into meaning, and then experiencing that in what we call the mind. But you're neither the mind nor brain, as I'll tell you later on. You are the whole package experiencing that dynamic process. And I say this because later on, when I get into lifestyle interventions, it's important to remember the difference between you, your brain, and your mind. So a lot of people ask me, what's the difference between Alzheimer's disease and senior moments? Somebody sent me this pic, and it's actually apparently real. I couldn't believe it. Reminding people when to turn for the senior center. Don't forget, remember to turn. Wake up, $124, turn now. There's even a game called Senior Moments. I haven't gotten that yet. Or calling someone and then forgetting who you called when you're on hold. These are all senior moments, right? And why do they occur? Well, I've heard this referred to as twinkle to wrinkle syndrome. In other words, in order to remember things, you have to be in the moment. You have to be mindful. You have to be excited. I mean, look at these kids. The twinkle is in their eyes. Everything is so amazing. Everything's new and fresh. They're so in the moment, right? They're curious about everything. They're excited by everything. And as we get older, we go from twinkle to wrinkle. Yeah, been there, done that, doesn't matter. Well, in this conversion from being incredibly excited about everything to no longer really caring about what's going on around you, saying, I've already been there. This is what I like to call going from wow moments to so what moments. So with age, we just we can be very busy. Most of us are very busy. We might become jaded. We might just pay less attention to what's going on around us for these reasons, kind of just, so what, been there, done that. Don't have to be mindful of that. Unlike a child who learns so well because they're so in the moment, so present and here and now. But the difference between a senior moment and Alzheimer's is that when memory lapses actually begin to challenge how you live your life, daily living is challenged. It's not just losing the keys, but you may be driving home and inexplicably you don't recognize your neighborhood, or you don't recognize streets you're on, and the information that you took for granted every day just leaves your brain and you can't get it back, or a recipe you've cooked your whole life and it's just gone, and it takes you, you can't get it back at all, or it might take hours to figure out what it was in that recipe. When those memory lapses become so severe, you can't get back the information. It's not just tip of the tongue syndrome when you forget a word or a name. That happens to everybody, but it's challenging your life. That's when it might be the beginning of Alzheimer's disease, and it's time to see a doctor or a neurologist or a psychiatrist. So this is where it happens. The battleground for Alzheimer's disease is in the hippocampus. Hippocampus means seahorse in Greek. This is the hippocampus here. And it actually does look like a seahorse. So that's how they named things way back then. But it's in the hippocampus, which is right through here in your brain, where these sensory signals that come in, it's photons hitting your eyes and mechanosensory receptors on your fingers feeling something rough or smooth. These are just random signals. When you're a baby, you don't know what they mean. I mean, an infant will see red shoes and it means nothing, right? There's color, there's shape, but you wouldn't have that meaning created in your brain that says red shoes. Maybe they belong to my mom, right? That has to be learned over time, and your neural network is sculpted. In fact, you're born with exponentially more synapses than you're going to end up with, because you lose them as you sculpt what you need to know as mom and dad and the world around you teaches you. So over time, signals that are electrochemically sent coming into your sensory organs most of that signaling ends up in this little area called the hippocampus. And in the hippocampus, the job is those sensory signals have to be made sense of. They're converted into meaningful information. And then that new information is eventually stored in other parts of the brain, like the cortex. And that new information has to be called as memory for you to then have a continuum, a flow of life where you can put the world around you, yourself, and other people into context. This can be challenged by senior moments, right? If you're not paying attention, as those signals come in, they may be turned into meaningful information, but you're not paying attention to it. Your mind's wandering, or you're jaded, or you're just not in the moment, and you suddenly forget where you are. Okay, that happens. That happens just because we're not as mindful and as present in the moment as we get older. But if you're getting this pathology shown below, plaques, amyloid plaques, this gooey material outside of nerve cells, the tangles in the middle here, which are forming in response to the amyloid that are choking the inside of nerve cells and killing them. And as the nerve cells die, inflammation, just like cytokine storm caused by COVID, but now in the brain, right? Like COVID, the COVID virus doesn't kill you; it induces cytokine storm, as you probably heard, inflammation, and that when that happens in the lungs and blood vessels, causes the damage that can lead to severe illness or death. Same thing in Alzheimer's. The plaques and tangles initiate the process decades before symptoms, but it's the neuroinflammation that ensues that causes enough damage to lead to the symptoms. That's when it's Alzheimer's disease. So here's those plaques and the tangles. We call the tangles tauopathy because the plaques are made of a protein called tau. We call the amyloid beta amyloid because it's made up of what's called the beta amyloid protein, or A beta. And here's neuroinflammation that involves cells called glial cells. Originally, in Greek, glia means glue. We used to think these glial cells glued nerve cells together. Now we know the glial cells play many roles in the brain, good and potentially bad if they're trying to protect the brain and killing the nerve cells around it. I'll get more into that later. So for a long time, we only knew about this pathology after Alzheimer described it in 1906. And it wasn't until 1984 that we figured out, this is George Glenner, who first figured out what the plaque was made of. He actually discovered this amyloid beta protein, or for short, A beta, as he named it, as the main sticky material in the plaque. And then later on, in 1987, as a student at Harvard, I discovered the gene that makes A beta. I named it the amyloid beta protein precursor gene, or APP, and two other groups also found the gene at the same time in 87. That was my doctoral thesis, and APP turned out to be the first Alzheimer's disease gene. So the first Alzheimer's gene brought us to amyloid. And then we found other genes that, again, brought us back to amyloid genes in 1995 called the presenilins. And now we know of families that have these early onset gene mutations that guarantee the disease. These are the Noonans, who I wrote about in my book, Decoding Darkness. And they also talked about in this book, The Gene Guillotine. And then in the book, Still Alice, and the movie Still Alice, Julianne Moore, she has a presenilin 1 mutation. In fact, the same one that August Dieter ended up having, that patient that Alzheimer first studied, who had early onset Alzheimer's in 1906. So these early onset genes have mutations that cause about 2% of Alzheimer's. They guarantee the disease, usually under 60 years old, and all of them seem to affect the deposition of beta amyloid in the brain. So that's what the first genetics told us. And then next came ApoE. Many of you probably heard ApoE because you can, if you get a 23andMe test, well, they're going to tell you your ApoE genotype. If you have an ApoE4 variant, which is in 20% of the population, well, it's in 60% of Alzheimer's patients. That means it's associated with the disease. If you have one E4 from one parent, it increases risk about 3.7-fold. Two E4s increase risk 14-fold. But unlike the early onset gene mutations in APP, presenilin 1, presenilin 2, ApoE4 doesn't guarantee you'll get the disease. For the most part, these mutations guarantee it. But here's the take-home point. All four of these genes, the first genes we found in the 80s and 90s, all brought us back to amyloid, beta amyloid deposition as what causes this disease. And to this day, I won't get into this, but we're finding many more genes in my lab and other labs that still bring us back to amyloid. This supports what's called the amyloid hypothesis, the amyloid is what triggers this disease. The genetics strongly supports this. Yet, with all that support, all these genes telling us amyloid causes this disease, well, every single clinical trial of some type of therapy or drug that is meant to bring amyloid down in the brain has failed to improve cognition in Alzheimer's patients. So this led to lots of questions. Well, does amyloid really cause this disease? The genetics says so. I want to tell you a story and to explain this. Brown and Goldstein won the Nobel Prize for discovering a family that had heart disease associated with hyperlipidemia. In other words, they found a family where they had a rare mutation that guaranteed they'd have heart disease by 60 years old, and it caused high cholesterol. And this was surprising at the time. They're saying, wow, what does cholesterol have to do with heart disease? They said, I don't know, but this family has high cholesterol, and it's through a gene mutation, and they're guaranteed to get heart disease. And fast forward, now we know that cholesterol, high cholesterol, begins the road to heart disease decades in advance. And if you already have congestive heart failure or had a heart attack, or you need a bypass, let's say you didn't take care of your cholesterol. Well, you can't just go to somebody who needs a bypass and say, here, take this drug to bring your cholesterol down. We know that's what caused it. Of course, you wouldn't do that. And Alzheimer's is the same thing, okay? But it's beta amyloid that's coming very early and triggering this disease that takes decades to propagate and finally get to the point of symptoms. So I'm going to tell you, right, is that the reason why these amyloid trials failed isn't because amyloid's the wrong target. It's because we did it at the wrong time. These graphs show how amyloid, if you follow this red line down here, amyloid begins decades before the disease begins, before symptoms occur. By the time amyloid has already peaked in the brain, it's as high as it's going to get, that's when you get the earliest signs of mild cognitive impairment, the earliest stages of Alzheimer's disease. So at this point, trying to bring the amyloid down is a little too late, because what's happened is this: the amyloid has triggered the tangles. The tangles are killing the nerve cells. This then triggers neuroinflammation. And we now know that neuroinflammation, once it's triggered, causes 10 times more damage than the plaques and tangles and the cell death caused there that got you here. So I like to think about amyloid as the match that lights the brush fires of tangles that spread over decades. And then this has to ignite forest fires of neuroinflammation before you get the disease. And you can also get tauopathy, these tangles and forms of these tangles other ways. There can be genetic mutations that cause tauopathies called frontal lobe dementia, PSP. You can get lots of bangs to the head, getting too many bangs to the head playing sports that can lead to chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE. But think about it, the bangs to the head come in the teens and 20s, maybe 30s, or if you're Tom Brady, 40s. But it takes decades for that tangle pathology to spread, igniting neuroinflammation before you get symptoms of dementia, in this case, CTE. So that's how to think about this, is that Alzheimer's is a tangle disease triggered by amyloid, but you don't get symptoms until all of this causes enough neuroinflammation. And what's interesting, and actually good news, is that one can have lots of plaques and lots of tangles, but if there is no neuroinflammation, there's no dementia, okay? So this is good news, because after 40 years old, most of us make plaques and tangles, but that has to trigger neuroinflammation. We know this because of resilient brains. Every once in a while, someone dies, let's say they're in their 80s, no symptoms of dementia or Alzheimer's, cognitively fine. And then the pathologist is shocked to see they have just as many plaques and tangles as an Alzheimer's patient. They say, was this an Alzheimer's patient? No, person was fine. Then the answer as to how they escaped Alzheimer's and dementia is always the same. Despite plaques and tangles, somehow they were lucky enough to not have triggered neuroinflammation. And because there's no neuroinflammation, the neurons survived, because neuroinflammation kills 10 times more nerve cells than the original plaques and tangles that get you there, okay? So what I'm going to tell you is that to prevent this disease, early on, we have to target plaques and tangles, maybe neuroinflammation. But to help a patient who's suffering right now, well, that match was lit. The tangles and brush fires were spreading, but there's a forest fire going on. And you're not necessarily going to put that forest fire out by blowing out the match unless you can go back in time. The amyloid was the match. So this is how to understand this disease. So this is the elephant in the room, as I said earlier. We don't diagnose Alzheimer's until the brain has degenerated to the point of dysfunction. We would never do this with diabetes or heart disease. We need to start detecting changes in the brain that are going to lead to Alzheimer's disease decades before the symptoms start and stop it. So why don't we? Why don't we know that things are going wrong in the brain? And I think it's obvious when we say that each year we go for our annual physical, right? Every year you go to the doctor, you get your physical. They ask you how you're feeling. They check your blood pressure. They check your heart rate. But from the neck up, there's no checkup, right? When they get from the neck up, they basically might look in I like to say, the holes in your head and your nose and your nostrils and your mouth and your ears and your eyes. Maybe your doc might ask you how you're doing mentally. Maybe they might give you a basic exam for mental acuity. But for the most part, we just don't look to ask physically what's going on with the brain as we do with the heart and the pancreas and other organs. So this is why Greg Fishone and Jonathan Rosenthal and I started the McCance Center for Brain Health that was supported by Henry and Allison McCance, two of our benefactors, also involved with Cure Alzheimer's Fund. Henry's the chair of the board there. And the simple idea was that is to basically appreciate and emphasize that our lifespan has greatly surpassed our health span, especially our brain health span. As we get older, our brain health and mental vitality gradually decline, but modern medicine keeps us getting older and older. So it's great that you're getting to 80, 85, 90, 95, 100 years old, but in half of the cases, roughly, the brain doesn't keep up, and you see diseases like Alzheimer's. So unlike how we monitor heart health with primary care, we check cholesterol and blood pressure. Cancer prevention, we might do a mammography or check your PSA or do a prostate exam. When it comes to brain health, we do nothing at all. We don't physically look for signs. And only when you show symptoms, because the brain is degenerated to the point that cognition is impaired or movement's impaired in Parkinson's, then we diagnose the disease. Very different from how we diagnose heart disease, cancer, or diabetes. So this is what we want to change with the McCance Center. We want to bring in a world where for Alzheimer's disease and other brain-related age diseases, we use this mantra of early prediction, early detection, early intervention. Early prediction means family history, means looking at genetics. We now know over 100 Alzheimer genes. Here's the original 4 that we and others found back in the 80s and 90s when I was a kid. And now we've continued to find more genes, over 100 of them. And we can put these, eventually get what's called polygenic risk scores. So in addition to looking at your family history to see if there's increased risk for you, you could also do start to do polygenic genetic testing. I like to tell people, if you have a family history of Alzheimer's, look at the earliest age of onset you know of among first-degree relatives. Take that age and subtract 20 to 30 years, and that's when you need to begin early detection. Okay, I have heart disease in my family. My dad, his dad, my dad's brother all died young with heart disease. So I started checking for signs of high cholesterol or problems with my heart back when I was in my late 20s, because my dad died at 45, right? This is how you got to think about Alzheimer's. But what do you do? How do you do early detection? Well, good news is we're starting to get there. We now have ways to image the brain to see plaques and tangles. Risa Sperling, Keith Johnson, others able to actually use PET scans to see the buildup of amyloid and tangles in the brain. We now have spinal fluid tests, which can be a little painful. So we also have blood tests where you can look in the blood for indicators that amyloid is brewing in your brain or that tangles are starting to form in your brain. Blood tests to see that whether neurons are starting to die in your brain, whether neuroinflammation has begun. And I'll tell you in a second about two new biomarkers we found that predict how well you're going to do as a normal elderly person with your cognitive trajectory going forward. And the results there were surprising. But before I get to that, there were also digital tests. I started a company with Sean Patel and Brian Nahad, where we're developing a neuropsych exam in virtual reality. It also does eye tracking. Think about when someone gets a concussion, right? The doc says, follow my finger with your eyes. And of course, you see the eyes can't track well. But what we're realizing is that as brain pathology builds with age, the eyes also don't track as well, but it's very, very, very subtle. So you need a device that can see nanosecond changes in tracking and how that correlates with the brain pathology beginning with age. So these are new digital technologies. This is just one example of one I'm working on that are also adding to early detection. But I mentioned that we found two new biomarkers, blood biomarkers, and I want to emphasize what they do because it's really interesting. We were working with Risa Sperling and the Harvard Aging Brain Study, where they're tracking 300 normal elderly to look at how they do with their cognitive function over 6 years. So over 6 years, they're getting neuropsych exams every year. They're getting the amyloid in their brain tested. The tangles are being looked at by imaging. They're getting their blood drawn. So if you look here, let's start over here on this graph here, B. This red line will show the cognitive trajectory on average of these 300 normal elderly over 6 years, starting to go downhill. But if they have a particular biomarker that's high in their brain, this is their trajectory. It's actually fine. And this is another one. This dashed red line is for people in the study who had high amyloid in their brain going downhill. But if they had another particular biomarker in their brain, if they had another biomarker in their blood, plasma that was high, their trajectory in solid red here is much better. So what were these? They were called interleukin 12 and interferon gamma. These are actually pro-inflammatory cytokines. These are mediators of inflammation in the body outside the brain that are meant to protect you from infection. So when interleukin 12 and interferon gamma are high, this primes these immune cells called T cells and macrophages to defend you better against infection. They're at a higher alert state. And so it seems that when the peripheral immune system outside the brain is primed and more pumped up to defend you against infection, that this allowed for better cognitive trajectory in these normal elderly, even when amyloid was present in the brain, this dashed line versus this solid red line. And we believe that this may relate to the work of my colleague, Rob Moyer, who tragically passed away a couple of years ago. And Rob Moyer was the one who found out that amyloid is not just junk. Turns out that amyloid helps protect the brain against infection. And moreover, he found that if microbes get into the brain and cause even low-grade infections, amyloid will form. Amyloid will actually deposit rapidly in response to a microbial infection, and the amyloid traps the microbes to protect the brain. So the idea was that not just genetics like ApoE and those genes I showed you can trigger amyloid, but microbes can trigger amyloid where the amyloid's made as a defense to protect you. So what if we go back here, what if by having better primed immune system peripherally to fight infection, it's less likely it's going to get into the brain and have to promote amyloid. We also found that infection can promote tangles, and we already know that infections can promote neuroinflammation. So it wasn't very surprising when we read all of these papers that said these different vaccines protect against Alzheimer's disease. The BCG vaccine for tuberculosis, which is used mainly overseas, was associated with lower incidence of Alzheimer's. Influenza vaccine, lower incidence of Alzheimer's. Tdap, which is tetanus and diphtheria, pertussis, lower incidence. Even COVID and shingles vaccines. Well, what do they have in common? These vaccines not only stop pathogens, but they pump up the immune system as you get these vaccines every year and prime you to be more pumped up against all infection, perhaps leading to less leakage of microbes in the brain. And over time, as we get older, the blood-brain barrier, which keeps these microbes out, starts to go downhill with age. So does your immune system. So could it be that if you pump up your immune system by naturally having, more of these two cytokines like we found, or having vaccines, that this is good for the brain because there's less microbe getting in, triggering Alzheimer's pathology. So we're not saying that microbes are the only things that do it. Genetics obviously does it. I'll talk about lifestyle, but microbes seem to play a role. So what do we do about it? Let's get into early intervention. How are we going to actually stop this disease? And this is a very, very busy slide. And I don't expect you to take it all in. But this shows how our lab is tackling all of these pathways of Alzheimer's disease one by one and trying to find what drugs already exist, repurposing drugs that are already safe or natural products out of nature that could be used. And the top of this diagram has to do with stopping amyloid and stopping tangles. The bottom has to do with stopping neuroinflammation and protecting against neuroinflammation. So the bottom line is if you want to prevent Alzheimer's early on in life, well, you stop the amyloid, you also stop the tangles that the amyloid is causing. There's a drug that stops amyloid now. There's a drug you may have heard of called Aduhelm out of Biogen, which was found to very effectively remove amyloid from the brain. The problem with that is that, and the FDA approved this drug to reduce amyloid levels. The problem is that in the vast majority of patients with either Alzheimer's or even mild cognitive impairment, this drug is unlikely to improve cognition. And I think you know why now, right? If you hit somebody really early enough, you might get some cognitive improvement. In fact, one of their phase 3 trials shows some marginal improvement in cognition. One failed to improve cognition. But in all cases, they removed amyloid, right? But go back to what I was telling you before, the cholesterol heart disease analogy, right? If you want to remove amyloid, it's like removing cholesterol to avoid heart disease. It's best to do that decades before symptoms. You have to hope there might be some benefit if you do it at the very earliest stages, which is what Biogen is doing. So this was a very controversial approval, and many newspaper articles saying insurers won't cover it. Many major medical institutions won't offer it because of serious doubts about whether it can improve cognition. But it does remove amyloid. So you might say, oh, well, that's great. We can use this to remove amyloid in those 38 million people in the country right now who have amyloid in their brain, but they don't yet have symptoms, like getting cholesterol. Well, the problem is this drug costs $56,000 a year. It has safety issues that are reversible, like possible brain hemorrhage or swelling. So you have to monitor the brain with imaging after you get your intravenous injection. So the overall cost of this with the imaging and the drug, approaches, more towards $70,000, $80,000, $90,000 per year. It can't afford to give 38 million people in this country that expensive a drug to bring their amyloid down. But here's the silver lining. The silver lining around this is that with the FDA, it's opened a door for other amyloid drugs. In other words, in my lab, we're seeing whether we can repurpose cheap, safe drugs like the asthma drug Cromolyn that we repurposed with a company called AZ Therapies to get it into the brain, or a supplement called Cat's Claw, which I work with a company on a supplement where Cat's Claw can also help clear the amyloid out of the brain, similar to the way Aduhelm does. Or we could try to reduce the A beta production in the brain, or we can try to, I won't get into the nuances of this, but you can reduce the size of the amyloid beta protein that makes the amyloid from 42 amino acids down to 37, and then you no longer make amyloid. That's called a gamma secretase modulator that my lab with Stephen Wagner at UCSD is getting into phase 1 trials this coming year. So there's all other ways of cheap, safe little white pills that can do the same thing. And the argument is if we can find something cheap enough and safe enough to bring amyloid down, then we go to the FDA and say, give us a chance to give this to the 38 million people who are amyloid positive, symptom negative, and let's see over 5 or 10 years if we reduce the incidence, the prevalence of Alzheimer's because we're stopping the amyloid early. Just like the experiment we did with heart disease, right? People take cholesterol drugs, and lowering cholesterol has put a big dent in the incidence and prevalence of heart disease. Can we do the same in Alzheimer's by hitting amyloid early? Well, like I said, Aduhelm may be a controversial approval, And it'll be unfortunate if somebody can't get covered for it and mortgages their house to give it to their dad who has late stage Alzheimer's and it doesn't help them. Yes, there's lots of problems there. But the silver lining is it's opened a door for cheaper drugs that will move amyloid down safely, and we can make our way toward a vision of early intervention hitting amyloid with safe drugs in tens of millions of people who need it, just like we do hitting cholesterol for heart disease, okay? So, but what do we do for patients who are suffering already? I mean, if hitting amyloid in them isn't going to be enough, what can we do? Well, in those patients, we have to either stop neuroinflammation or we have to protect them against the cell death that's caused by neuroinflammation. Cell death is caused by these little microglial cells that are normally housekeepers in the brain, now turning into killers or producing free radicals, causing oxidative damage, killing neurons. So as it turns out, the fastest growing number of genes for Alzheimer's, beginning with the one we found in 08, CD33, followed by these others, TREM2, et cetera. The fastest set or category of genes for Alzheimer's today mainly implicate these cells called microglial cells, which basically control immunity in the brain and control neuroinflammation. So to understand this, this is a microglial cell. And normally, under normal conditions, the microglial cells are nurturers, they're housekeepers, they're janitors. When you sleep at night, they clean up debris, okay? They're helping to prune the synapses to create the perfect neural network. But while they're cleaning up debris, okay, they are also sentinels. And if while cleaning debris, they let's say they eat a microbe or they eat a virus and they say, whoa, there's an infection here. Or let's say they eat a neuron that died because they're cleaning up that debris, the shrapnel of the dead neuron. And they say, whoa, a neuron died. If that happens enough, they're signaled to think that neurons are dying and they assume it's infection. They're evolutionarily programmed going back tens of thousands of years that when they eat a neuron that died, or certainly a microbe, they sense it's an infection and they become warriors. They change shape and then they start killing everything in sight. They say this part of the brain's infected, even if it's not. The nerve cells can be dying simply because of genetics. They don't know that. The nerve cells are dying. The microglial cells say, stop cleaning and stop and now begin killing because this part of the brain's infected. We have to wipe it out so that the infection doesn't spread. Well, this, folks, is neuroinflammation. And neuroinflammation kills 10 times more neurons than how it got triggered by plaques and tangles, killing just X number of nerve cells early on, decades before symptoms. So it goes back to that match, that brush fire, the tangles spreading like brush fires, the match being amyloid, the neuroinflammation, the forest fire. Well, these guys set the fire. These guys set the forest fire from the brush fire. So normally these little microglial cells are clearing debris down here and housekeeping, but when they sense things going wrong, they cause inflammation. And we're finding which genes drive inflammation up and down, and we're trying to control them. We're doing gene therapy on some of these genes in mice, hopefully going to humans. There are companies doing immunotherapies against these genes. So there's a whole new class of Alzheimer's drug development in trying to target neuroinflammation. In our lab, we're using what's called Alzheimer's in a dish. Okay, so Du-Yan Kim in our group realized that mice are really bad models for Alzheimer's. You can give mice plaques with those early onset Alzheimer genes, but the plaques won't cause tangles. It takes a real long time to get neuroinflammation from from the damage the plaques will do. And if you want to screen drugs in mice, good luck, because each mouse takes a year to get the disease, and it's expensive. So if you wanted to screen mice, it would cost millions of dollars. So what we developed was Alzheimer's in a dish. We take human stem cells and we make different cells from the brain, neurons, glial cells, et cetera, and then we grow them in a gel-like material that mimics the brain. And each one of these mini brains is the size of a paper punch. So this whole tray here is the size of an index card. And each little well is the size of a paper punch. And in each one, you have a little bit of gel with a mini brain organoid or 3D gel matrix where you have neurons and glial cells creating this disease. So I'll show you it here. Here you have, in this gel down here, you have the neurons. They're making plaques and tangles. The microglial cells are up top. Let me show you just what happens here. These green things are nerve cells in a dish. This is one of those wells in the plate. These are human nerve cells peacefully coexisting with the little blue dots that are the microglial cells, okay? The microglial cells are nurturing, they're housekeeping, they're doing their job. But if we make these nerve cells create plaques and tangles, let me show you what happens. The microglial cells rush in larger numbers, see all the blue? And they eat. They're eating those neurons. They're destroying it. They're saying, wipe this out. There's plaques, there's tangles, nerve cells are dying. Those microglial cells are programmed as they were 10,000, 20, 30,000 years ago, wipe out this part of the brain. If neural cells are dying, they assume it's an infection, even if it's not. This, folks, is neuroinflammation. This is what we have to stop in Alzheimer's patients to help them or protect against. So in this dish model, and using other models, one of the successes we had was with a small company that I was a co-founder of called Amyloid. Two young kids from Brown University, they were undergrads, came to see me for a project with an idea about how to protect nerve cells from dying due to neuroinflammation with a combination therapy. And the first thing we did was actually we tried it in ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease first. The clinical trial worked. And now the company is waiting for, is on their way to seek FDA approval for what will be the newest ALS drug in a long time, AMX0035. We also did an Alzheimer's trial with it. So this is an example where you can just use nerve cells in a dish and treat them in a way that kills them, like neuroinflammation, find drugs to protect them and allow them to survive. And this worked in ALS, and now the Alzheimer results from the small phase 2 trial will be announced pretty soon. But in my lab, what we're as interested in, or even more interested in, is how do we stop that neuroinflammation itself? How do we put out the fire? Well, this summarizes what we have. We have 42 different drugs or natural products. These are approved drugs or natural products we screen that stop the neuroinflammation. We have 44 different drugs that get the amyloid cleared out of the brain, kind of like the Biogen Aduhelm, but with cheap little drugs and natural products. We've identified 31 drugs and natural products in our screen that prevent the amyloid from causing the tangles. This was 5 years of work, about $5 million, funded by the Cure Alzheimer's Fund, probably the highest impact research foundation in the country. They're local in Boston, Cure Alzheimer's Fund, they're located in Waltham. And now, because we have these cheap, safe drugs, natural products, we're starting to plan clinical trials, combining them, finding ways to either prevent Alzheimer's by hitting the plaques and tangles up here, or helping patients who are suffering now by stopping the neuroinflammation or protecting the nerve cells from dying. So that's all ongoing, and we're getting those trials going soon at Mass General and also around the country. But, and just to summarize what I told you, but in the meantime, until these drugs get online to either prevent or treat Alzheimer's disease, what can we do right now in terms of lifestyle to stave off age-related brain pathology, to keep the brain healthy and stave off Alzheimer's? And the good news is that we know that in 95% of cases of dementia, yes, there's genetics, and yes, in 5% the genetics cannot be overcome except by drugs. But in 95% of cases, lifestyle can mitigate genetic risk for dementia, as shown in this study here. And some of the ways to do this, and this Jonathan Rosanth in our group is very strong on this Life Simple 7, controlling blood pressure, not smoking, regular exercise, keeping track and reducing diabetes risk, healthy diet, weight control, controlling lipids and cholesterol, and all that's summarized here. So there are things you can do. Now, when I wrote some books with Deepak Chopra on the brain and on genetics and on how to stay healthy, how to prevent inflammation, I came up with an acronym called SHIELD. And SHIELD, I'll show you in a minute what it stands for, is used as part of the McCance Brain Care Score developed by Zaina Shamali, where this brain care score is for folks who come to the McCance Center at Mass General. They'll be asked questions about their BMI, diet, alcohol, exercise, muscle strength, sleep, smoking, cholesterol, glycemia, resting blood pressure, social relationships. Do you meditate? Purpose in life. All these things are assessed as part of the brain care score. And when we have to give them advice about how to protect their brain, we summarize that with this acronym that I coined a few years ago called SHIELD: sleep, handling stress, interaction with others, exercise, learning new things, and diet. So let me go through these. Sleep is probably most important. If I had to name the most important one here, I actually might say sleep. You need 7 to 8 hours of day, 7 to 8 hours per day of sleep. And if you don't get enough sleep at night, taking a nap counts, because every time you dream and then have deep sleep afterwards, even in a nap, let's say you take a nap, have some dreams, and you're in deep sleep, drool a little bit, that counts as one rinse cycle for the brain. Okay, and that cycle of dream to deep sleep, those microglial cells, when they're housekeepers and janitors, they do their good job, like scrubby bubbles, and they remove the amyloid, they remove the debris, they keep the brain healthy. Okay, so enough sleep is very important to get enough of that cleaning. Sometimes I jokingly call sleep mental floss, right? Getting all that crap out of the brain, okay? This is another important one, handling stress, H. Well, stress leads to the production of cortisol, which kills brain cells. That can trigger neuroinflammation. Stress is associated with so many age-related diseases, it's hard to keep count. It prevents optimal mental performance, physical performance. It actually destroys neurons in the brain. And it does more than that. Stress gets us to the importance of mindfulness meditation. Mindfulness meditation has been shown to improve the amount of inflammation in the body and brain. It reduces the activity of genes involved with inflammation, C-reactive protein levels. It actually affects immune cells and telomerase activity. In fact, we did a trial ourselves with Alyssa Appel, Eric Schott, and Deepak Chopra a few years ago, where we had basically 60 women at a resort, and 30 of them just hung out at the resort and had fun, but they ate the same food as 30 other women who went into a intensive meditation, 1 week of intensive meditation, learning primordial sound meditation, body and breath awareness, etc. And there were also meditation teachers, 30 meditation teachers doing the same thing per week. And we looked at all of them before, during, and after this week of intensive meditation versus 30 women who were relaxing at the resort, but again, doing the same amount of sleep, exercise, and diet. And we found amazing results. When we looked at the gene expression profiles and networks, what we saw was that you could actually distinguish the vacation network from the meditation network. We were able to come up with an algorithm that basically, in 90% of the cases, if we did this blindly, in 90% of cases, we could predict who was the expert meditator, the teacher, versus the novice meditation group versus the vacation group. And what we saw was this incredible effect on gene networks to control amyloid clearance from the brain, to control neuroinflammation, wound healing. All of these expression profiles were better after just 1 week of meditation. Even telomerase, the anti-aging enzyme, and in fact, Elizabeth Blackburn, who won a Nobel Prize for discovering telomerase, was on the study. She measured telomerase for us. We saw a 20 to 40% increase in telomerase in 1 week, which is what, and telomerase grows the tips of the chromosomes that start to wither away with age and cause cellular senescence. So we saw increased telomerase activity. This is just 1 week of meditation. And the key to meditation is mindfulness. And I love this definition of mindfulness by Jon Kabat-Zinn. Some of you may have seen. Mindfulness is awareness that arises through paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally, in the service of self-understanding and wisdom. Being in the moment with purpose, okay? I like to refer to what we call the 4 A's of mindfulness that Deepak and I talk about in our books. The 4 A's are awareness, paying attention to your experience in the moment without judgment, like Jon Kabat-Zinn said. Appreciation, paying attention to those around you with affection and compassion. Attitude, paying attention to your outlook with kindness, tolerance, curiosity, staying in the moment, being excited about the moment, accepting others, not judging them. And I'll tell you why this is so important, because in all these cases, you're turning off something called the default mode network, including acceptance, accepting the moment, accepting that everything that happens right now is the only thing that can happen. All you can do is learn from it and in the moment plan for the future. So those are the 4 A's of mindfulness. And I wrote a book with Deepak called Superbrain, where we emphasized that, as I talked about earlier, SIFT, your brain is bringing you sensory information, imagination, feelings, thoughts, that the problem is we mistakenly identify with this SIFT. We experience SIFT and we identify with the experience. And what we talk about in Superbrain is that the best thing for the brain to pull out of what's called the default mode network, which as I'll show you where Alzheimer's pathology propagates, is to become the observer of SIFT. So I like to explain it this way, right? If you see a red car drive down the road, right, you would say, I see a red car. There's a red car. You wouldn't say, I am a red car, right? You don't associate with the experience of seeing a red car by saying, I am a red car, right? That's obvious. But if that red car speeds to a puddle and splashes you with mud, you may say, I am very angry. I am mad. You may say worse than that. But think about what you're saying. You're saying, I am angry. Well, guess what? Your brain, in that case, instead of bringing you bringing you the sensation, the image of a red car, brought you the feeling of anger when the mud went all over your face, right? The brain has to do that so you'll survive, right? It has to make sure that doesn't happen to you again. You stay further in on the sidewalk because that can challenge your life. The mud's in your eyes. You might go into the street and get hit by a car. For survival, your brain brought you the feeling of anger. But we say, I am angry. Well, when the brain brought you the vision of a red car, you didn't say, I am a red car. So there's no need to say, I am angry. Experience the feeling of anger your brain brings you, but don't identify with the experience of anger. This is a way to keep the brain healthy because it turns off the default mode network. We call this mountaintop consciousness. Observe and guide the activities of your brain as your brain brings you your world through SIFT, and don't identify with it. And here's the reason why. The default mode network is surprisingly, amazingly correlating with how Alzheimer's disease propagates and spreads over decades. And this is for amyloid plaques, also for tangles. And we know from the work of David Holtzman that the more these neurons in the default mode network fire, the more amyloid you make, the more that's going to cause tangles and then eventually neuroinflammation. Well, when is the default mode network turned on? Well, when you're idle, when you're ruminating about the past, or you're remorseful about the past, or you're anxious about the future. Whenever you're just dwelling inside, you're not mindful, you're not in the moment, you're far off, you're upset about something from the past, you're anxious about going to the dentist next week, you're ruminating. Well, that's when your default mode network is most on. When is it turned off? Well, during deep sleep, great. When meditating, if you're doing good meditation, whenever you're more mindful, when you're in the moment, you're present, when you're emphasizing the twinkle versus the wrinkle, when you're focused on goal-oriented tasks, reading a good book, learning something new, doing some type of job or hobby, playing an instrument, gardening, whenever you're task-oriented in the moment, not just dwelling or ruminating, you turn off this pathway that propagates Alzheimer's pathology. And that, folks, is why mindfulness at every stage of life, from meditating to getting enough sleep, to being in the moment, appreciating what's around you, okay, smelling the roses, that's why it's so important. It actually fights Alzheimer's pathology. So I like to say, to just summarize the take-home points from this trilogy we wrote, as take time to observe SIFT, but don't identify with what your brain is bringing you. Be present without dwelling on the past or being anxious about the future. Learn from the past and plan for the future, but do so while living in the present, being in the moment. And in terms of bad habits that may be bad for you, and I'll get into those more in a moment, think about how to rewire your neuroplasticity. Take advantage of your fact that your neural network is plastic. You can rewire it. And I always like to say, trust your intuition, which will actually grow as you become more mindful and present in the moment. So the next part of SHIELD is interaction with others. Staying social is important. Now, loneliness increases risk for Alzheimer's twofold. Being alone and liking it is fine. But if you're lonely, meaning you're alone and you don't like it and it causes stress, that's bad for you. So staying socially interactive is also important, getting that stimulation from others. Exercise, very important. I put 10,000 steps per day. That's a lot for some people. I think as long as for a half hour per day, you do something to really get blood flow going. I ride a recumbent bike or I swim, at least a half hour a day. Or if you're just going to take a walk, take an hour-long walk per day. But just remember to move around, because when you exercise, blood flow to the brain actually brings in nutrients from the liver and other organs that allow the brain to induce neurogenesis, the birth of new neurons. It induces growth factors like BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. The combination of neurogenesis and brain-derived neurotrophic factor can really benefit the brain. We showed this in Alzheimer's disease mice. So exercise is incredibly important. L, learn new things, right? When you learn new things, you make new synapses. And at the bottom line is what threatens healthy brain aging is loss of synapses. At the end of the day, inflammation, plaques, tangles, et cetera, it's losing synapses that correlates with the degree of dementia, whether it's age-related or Alzheimer's related. So every day you want to build up your synaptic reserve. In other words, as you learn new things, you make new synapses. And because learning is based on association with what you already knew, you strengthen the synapses you already had. So you build up the strength of your neural network. So the more synapses you make, we say, the more you can lose over time before you lose it. It's like money in the bank, right? You save up money in the bank when you retire. So as you spend money, you still have more money left. Same thing with synapses. That's learning new things. So if you're learning something new with my lecture today, I'm helping you out. If I'm putting you to sleep, I'm still helping you out either way. And finally, diet. Diet, I would actually put second after sleep and shield, because the gut microbiome, these trillions of bacteria that live in your gut, directly affect your brain. Many of you take a probiotic or you eat yogurt, right? That's great. But you also have to keep those bacteria in your gut happy, because they influence mood. They strongly influence neuroinflammation in the brain. They influence how much amyloid's made in the brain. So the happier your gut bacteria are, there's 8,000 strains of bacteria in your gut. You only see 10 or 12 of them on your yogurt can, right? Your yogurt container. There's 8,000 strains, trillions of bacteria. And when they're balanced and living in harmony, that's when they produce the metabolites that go through the gut-brain axis from your gut to your brain. And these are metabolites that do everything from reduce neuroinflammation to induce the removal of amyloid. We're now working on mechanisms by which that happens. We published papers on things like irisin. Irisin is produced by muscle. It goes into the brain and actually reduces inflammation. You can also induce the enzymes that break down amyloid in the brain, all through diet from a healthy gut microbiome and through exercise, okay? So in terms of how do you keep the gut microbiome healthy? Well, the Mediterranean diet, you have to have a lot of fiber in your diet. That means less red meat, more fiber, fruits, veggies, nuts, leafy greens. Cut down on fats and sugar. Eat yogurt with whole grains or a side salad with lunch or dinner. Take antioxidant foods, blueberries, green tea, dark chocolate, even red wine in moderation. I take an omega-3 every day, EPA and DHA. I get it from vegan-sourced rather than from fish oil, just because fish oil can have heavy metals in it. I'm also a vegetarian, so that's also why. Consider probiotic supplement and other supplements that might promote brain health. We can get into that maybe in the Q&A. But the bottom line is that when you have enough probiotic and prebiotic, the fiber that comes with seeds, nuts, whole grains, vegetables, fruit, when you have probiotic plus prebiotic, it's called a symbiotic. And we showed in Alzheimer's mice that if we give them a symbiotic, meaning a prebiotic fiber plus probiotic bacteria, like a probiotic pill, in the Alzheimer's mice, we see a dramatic decrease in amyloid and in neuroinflammation in the Alzheimer's mice. A classic symbiotic for breakfast is yogurt with live cultures plus whole grains like granola clusters, and add in dark chocolate as an antioxidant. Very easy way to get at least one symbiotic per day. This is what I usually have for breakfast. and when I have time for breakfast, but this is a very important part of a symbiotic breakfast. So in conclusion, I want to say that, this advice of shield, you might say, well, is it too late for me? And I like to make the point that if you look at yourself right now, your mind and body and brain right now are the results of your choices and habits yesterday. It's over. You can only be what you are now based on yesterday. But you have to remember your mind, body, and brain health tomorrow are the results of your choices and habits today. And thanks to plasticity in the brain, epigenetics, meaning modification of gene expression through lifestyle and habit, your habits today will matter later on. And you can adapt a shield type lifestyle to maximally protect your brain at any time. So I like to summarize this at the end this way. Sleep more, meditate more, see friends more, move more, learn more, eat less and healthier. And because I'm a geneticist and discover genes for Alzheimer's and other diseases, choose your ancestors wisely, although I understand that might not be possible. So let me end there and just show my funding sources and the people in my unit who do all this great work and my collaborators. Most of my funding comes from Cure Alzheimer's Fund and NIA, the JPP Foundation, Open Philanthropy, Good Ventures. I'll stop there and I'm happy to take your questions. Thank you very much for your attention.